Welcome back. I will now briefly introduce the order of the panelists in the order they're going to speak for our second panel. Our first speaker is Chancio Willis, co-founder and chief executive officer of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. Our second speaker will be Kathleen Payton, president and CEO of Fifth Ward Community Redevelopment Corporation. Our third speaker is Julia Orduña, Southeast Texas Regional Director, Texas Housers. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Xiaoqi Sim, Vice President for Applied Research, Episcopal Health Foundation. And our fifth speaker, our final speaker for panel 2, is Ben Hirsch, Director of Strategic Partnerships, West Street Recovery. So we'll start with you, Ms. Willis. Please proceed.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and distinguished members of the Commission. My name is Chancio Willis, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, IDEM. And I'm ever so grateful for the opportunity to share information with you today regarding the federal government's response to Hurricane Harvey, as well as to highlight my organization's innovative work in prioritizing equity as a solution to reduce the impact of disasters on marginalized communities across the United States and globally. Systemic policy, programs, and practices create and contribute to disproportionate disaster impacts among low-income communities and people of color. Vulnerable, underserved, and or marginalized communities are forced into high-risk, high-exposure living situations, contributing to increased risk for loss of life and property, which increases vulnerability and decreases resilience. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered a speech where he described the other America, one America that serves and supports the lives and livelihoods of white Americans, and another America that is punitive, hostile, and apathetic towards people of color, the poor, and otherwise underrepresented groups. Now, at a granular level, and much like the two Americas that Dr. King described, there are two emergency management systems operating in this country. And those two systems have tremendous impact on marginalized people before, during, and after disasters. As discussed earlier today, the emergency management system as we know it, one that aims to reduce the harmful effects of hazards and disasters, does not work the same way for everyone. Some benefit from it, and some are further harmed by it. Those that are affluent and are middle class, white homeowners, etc., have the expectation of justice and full recovery in the unfortunate event of an unforeseen disaster. The emergency management system has the policies and programs that were put in place to assure them a full and timely recovery post-disaster. Those neighborhoods are restored faster, and if there is significant damage, they are provided with more funding to move to a safer, less hazard-prone location. Conversely, the other America must endure the impact of the other emergency management system, a system that does not provide full or timely recovery, a system that is more likely to deny requests for assistance, a system that delays and prevents recovery in a methodical fashion. This other system does not recognize that biased policies such as redlining and segregation increase a community's exposure to hazards, and in fact, sees the members of that community as acceptable losses. This other emergency management system operates within the construct that those that live in higher value neighborhoods that are educated and that have more access to resources are thus more valuable and deserving of full recovery and a greater share of funding resources to mitigate against future disasters. The overarching goal of disaster policies, both then and today, has been to restore economic stability and wealth to land and homeowners. The federal response to Hurricane Harvey is a repeat of many other disasters that have occurred throughout history. The government has never prioritized the most vulnerable within our society in times of disaster: the working poor, immigrants, indigenous groups, people with disabilities, and the list goes on. In fact, history tells us that these groups are sacrificed first, and their collective needs for restoration post-disaster are considered last. Based on a post-disaster survey, 45% of affected residents during Hurricane Harvey said that they were not getting help. And that number rose to 64% amongst Black residents. More alarming, approximately 40% of those applications were denied without reason, while others were denied because their homes were located in flood zones, and thus they were required to carry flood insurance. Of course, this is a luxury for lower income residents. Disasters should not be seen as singular events. They are an ongoing phenomenon used to authorize and impose further suffering on vulnerable groups. It is post-disaster that we see redistricting lines shift and voter suppression. It was after Katrina that we saw disaster gentrification, where an entire city was absolutely shifted in terms of demographics to become majority white. FEMA denied recovery funding to thousands of African-American people post-disaster when they denied heirs property rights, which forced them to leave the city they love. As you see, disasters have immediate impact on underserved communities and long-term impacts. When an entire group of people are intentionally allowed to suffer physical, emotional, and economic harm, one might call it a crime against humanity. In emergency management, we call it disaster recovery. There are many federal and state organizations that are now touting equity as their focus because of the Biden administration's equity mandate, but their actions are performative. They are doing what they need to do to check the box by hiring untrained equity consultants and failing to make the bold, sweeping changes that will actually impact people and how they are treated in disaster. In fact, there has been no move to intentionally hire or contract non-white-led disaster management firms to lead major or minor disaster response and recovery efforts. This is significant because disaster recovery firms come into a community to provide the initial damage assessments, to provide inspections, and to supplement state resources. FEMA has no requirement for cultural competency training for contractors, its inspectors, or for anyone in their workforce. And so they continue to contract firms that have not been trained with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This will lead to a repeat of disproportionate impact. Our organization believes that disaster equity must be implemented as the primary focal point for federal response and recovery. IDEM deploys disaster equity response teams post-disaster to assess equity in federal response and recovery. In closing, while natural disasters do not discriminate, their long-term impact disproportionately falls on marginalized groups. The marginalized homeowners must wait the longest, often years, to receive assistance and complete their recovery. That delay and that lack of predictability harms survivors and causes irreversible damage to children, to families, and seniors who suffer unnecessarily because of this lengthy process. Equity should be a commitment and embedded into all of our policies and programs. We must prioritize the people and focus on humanity with approaches that ensure equity in transaction. And currently, we are doing the most for the most. Thank you for your time.
I apologize. You ended 4 seconds early. Thank you very much. So thank you, Ms. Willis. So I'll call on Ms. Flanagan Payton next.
Good morning, and thank you, Commissioner Cantu. And I appreciate the conversation and the dialogue that has taken place thus far. I am Kathy Flanagan Payton. I have the awesome honor to be a native resident of the community that I serve, known as Houston's Fifth Ward. I represent an organization, Fifth Ward Community Redevelopment Corporation, a nonprofit organization, a NeighborWorks Charter affiliate, and unofficially what I'm going to reference as a CEMA, a Community Emergency Management Agency, because we often respond to the needs of our community. We are a catalytic organization committed to building and preserving an inclusive Fifth Ward community by developing places and opportunities for people to live, work, and play. And as the steward of Houston's historic Fifth Ward and comprehensive community developer, Fifth Ward seeks to enhance the quality of life for individuals and families, eliminate blight, attract investment and resources, encourage commercial and business development, coordinate government and public service, and offer a sense of destination and creative placemaking. The finished product is a healthy and vibrant community for resident and visitors alike. Much has been said about underserved communities, and I want to emphasize that this conversation is long overdue. And while we only reference Hurricane Harvey, I can attest that the residents and families in Fifth Ward are even going back to recovery as far back as Hurricane Ike in 2008. Yes, today, 4+ years post-Hurricane Harvey, and now followed by numerous other natural disasters to include Hurricane Imelda, the ongoing COVID pandemic, and the recent winter storm Uri, Fifth Ward Community Redevelopment Corporation put on its SEMA hat to encourage recovery efforts and to continue to help Fifth Ward residents recover from the travesty of even Hurricane Harvey storms, the flooding, and we've met basic needs, provided emergency financial assistance, we've restored homes, provided temporary relocation, offered housing case management and construction management services for our clients. In addition to our targeted service area of the Greater Fifth Ward, we've had to extend our recovery efforts to bordering communities to include Cashmere Gardens, Trinity Gardens, the Homestead area, and limited parts of City Gas, Pleasantville, and the East End. The demographic makeup of each of these areas are largely African-American and Hispanics and low moderate income families, many living below poverty. Our recovery efforts are an extension of our work that we were chartered to do 32+ years ago, serving vulnerable communities. We never thought our emphasis would be on disaster recovery. Our work commenced immediately following the storm as we began to receive and distribute donated supplies and materials. This is critically important as government funds and access to such in communities like Fifth Ward is almost insulting. It's a day late and $1 short. It appears that the system is designed to further beset and defeat those who need the resources and help the most. The system and process are cumbersome, restrictive, inadequate in most cases, and inequitable. Responses from beneficiaries suggest that those with less get less, and those with more get more. The reality is that those with less actually need more. We don't know what it will take for our government to understand and appreciate that. In areas like Houston's Fifth Ward, the process of applying for assistance was cumbersome and the return was disappointing at best. Citizens were frustrated by a process largely centered around technology and access, without regard to the limited access of those living in poverty and those lacking tech savvy, particularly seniors and those who are disabled. You see, less than 40% of the residents in Fifth Ward really have access to technology and the internet. To reduce the burden and deficits presented by this inequitable process, we avail technology kiosks and counselors who are dedicated to assisting individuals and families in applying, only to be disappointed by the lack of support and the ineligibility letters that they often and frequently got. Fifth Ward's efforts quickly expanded in response to the need to assist families with clean out, muck and gut, and emergency needs. For the first 2 weeks, we deployed volunteers with required materials and supplies daily to assist families and eventually transitioned to Friday and Saturday deployment of approximately 130 volunteers daily during the immediate recovery efforts. Timing is optimal to minimize destruction and loss, and neither the state or FEMA are optimal in circumstances where time is of essence. The circumstances after Hurricane Harvey in Houston was no different. Non-government organizations stand ready to serve with increasing capacity and our understanding of needs in the community. Government and FEMA response efficiencies, while improving, are far from optimal, and the disparities among the most vulnerable continue to grow. Recovery is often impeded by due process. To date, we've assisted more than 500 families in complete recovery and rebuild of their homes, and 1,500 families with a disbursement of $7 million for families impacted by Harvey, all from private resources and philanthropy, with complete clean out, muck and gut, furniture moving, additional supplies to remediate mold and other toxins caused by the water damage, repairs, and emergency financial unmet needs. This work is in addition to the countless families who were served as a part of our distribution of dry goods, personal items, non-perishables, and go boxes equipped with mucking tools, contractors' trash bags, masks, gloves, and cleaning supplies for those that assistance, but supplies were limited and resources were unavailable. However, the resources, again, to support these families are from private philanthropists. As an organization working in the community, many have adjusted to a new norm as recovery is relative, and we continue with intake and vetting for additional victims. And our total portfolio today, 4 years later, is still in excess of 400 clients who still have varied and ongoing needs for recovery services. We have and continue to canvass streets and residents to assess need, clean, muck and gut flooded homes, coordinate receipt and distribution of cleaning and personal supplies, and provide support to families, other service providers in need of basic assistance. Why do we do this? Because people do not trust the government. It's discouraging that so many still have not received assistance. Today, our efforts are more focused on comprehensive repair and rebuilding services, emergency financial assistance, and we continue to be a hub for area community groups, faith-based groups, and elected officials to coordinate, warehouse, and distribute donated supplies. Priority is continuing to be given to those families who were declined by FEMA without insurance and experiencing other vulnerabilities. During the peak of recovery, Fifth Ward CRC actually had to hire 6.5 full-time staff to meet the ongoing demands of recovery, counseling, administrative, and operation managers, design, project, and case management systems, and added additional skilled contractors who were engaged for home assessments and inspections. Who covered the cost of that? Who carries the burden? The nonprofit organization. Why? Because we have the organizational experience and capacity to do owner-occupied home rehabilitation and have managed community development block grant and social service block grant funds for owner-occupied home rehabilitation and recovery programs in the past. Additionally, we continue to offer and have storage containers and offsite warehouses for additional supplies ready to respond each year during hurricane season and the ongoing needs, because it seems that our government doesn't believe that we'll be hit by disaster again. Recognizing the financial strains and vulnerabilities, Fifth Ward CRC made emergency financial assistance up to $1,500 available to clients to mitigate income loss from disaster, minimize foreclosures resulting from increased living expenses and homelessness, and assist with utilities or unmet expenses. These resources have supported both recovery from weather-related disasters and now the pandemic. Lastly, Fifth Ward CRC has developed plans of hosting a long-term recovery resource center staffed with housing counselors, caseworkers, volunteer legal services, and computer kiosks for residents' use in long-term recovery efforts and plans, filing claims, printing and scanning documents, and staying connected electronically during their transitions. Our services are not exclusive to a particular ethnicity or economic class, and we're able to assist families up to 400% of the federal poverty line, but we have established criteria that prioritize assistance based on need. The demands from impacted families continue for those.
I'm going to interrupt. I know you're doing so much, it takes you so long to describe it. So I'm grateful for you. I do apologize for interrupting.
No problem.
And I also apologize to Mr. Aguilar. You're our panelist, so I'll call on you last. I'll save the best for last. After Ms. Payton, I'm going to call on Ms. Orduña.
Good afternoon, commissioners. I'd like to dedicate this time to Dolores Torres and Erlene Flowers, two Harvey Forgotten Survivor Caucus members that have passed away while waiting for their home to be repaired by government-funded programs. My name is Julia Orduña, and I attend today as Southeast Regional Director for Texas Housers, whose staff has worked to understand government policies and practices involved with disaster recovery and relief, and the disaster recovery experience of low-income survivors, focusing on racial equity and civil rights issues since Hurricane Rita in 2008. FEMA's disaster programs during Hurricane Harvey created discriminatory effects for low-income and marginalized communities, which raised several civil rights concerns. Their damage documentation processes generate inaccurate data, which results in unfair distribution of FEMA funds and ultimately compound the effects of uncoordinated program administration that further produces disparate racial impact in the subsequent allocation of much greater amounts of CDBG-DR funding for long-term recovery. Programs must be administered with empathy, understanding, and the urgency that is demanded by the experience of disaster survivors. Their lives are no longer intact. Their homes and possessions are destroyed. In the wake of disaster, many do not have time to trudge through multiple application processes, track down paperwork, and find extra money to pay for notary services, faxing services, printing services, and all the other documentations that require financial support. The FEMA program needs to recognize the unique needs confronted by low-income people of color, people with disabilities, and senior citizens. Adopting a trauma-informed approach to program administration, where there is enough flexibility to work with survivors and tailor these eligibility requirements to the available documentation and capacity of survivors, will assist FEMA in understanding the cost and difficulty in navigating their programs. The FEMA needs assessment is the first of many applications for recovery that survivors are required to submit. Government agencies have pushed to develop significant outreach strategies in order to target hard-to-reach survivors. If government wanted to fully reach marginalized classes of survivors, the needs assessment should be used as the main point of entry for the entire disaster recovery apparatus. Sharing data between government agencies involved in both recovery and rebuild efforts would ensure that survivors have been touched by any program do not get left behind. It is easier for agencies to withdraw people from a program after confirming they no longer have that need for assistance than for survivors to submit multiple applications to different sources of assistance in time of crisis and possibly lose the opportunity to recover. I also reference the effect of FEMA's programs in perpetuating segregated neighborhoods. In 2018, Texas Housers acquired FEMA individual assistance denial rate data for homeowners and renters affected by Hurricane Harvey. The overall denial rate of homeowners was 26%. Those who reported an income as over $70,000 a year only had an ineligibility rate of 10%, while those making less than $15,000 a year had a denial rate of 46%. As a household income climbed, their likelihood of being approved by FEMA also increased. Also potentially discriminatory is FEMA's claim determination, which is certified by FEMA field inspectors. Poorly trained inspectors and inspectors who cannot communicate in the survivor's native language lead to potential discrimination. We found racial inequities in FEMA's verified loss documentation, a property value-based assessment, which reduces the survivor's ability to obtain adequate compensation to rebuild their homes. And FEMA programs do not provide financial support to relocate to safer areas, which further widens the gap for ability to recover for people of color. FEMA data reports both the real property and personal property loss of homeowners, but only determines the unmet need of renters based on their personal property loss. When analyzing FEMA's Harvey allocations, Texas Housers found that though renters and homeowners made up roughly equal percentages of total applications received by FEMA, 84% of assistance was received by homeowners, while only 16% was offered to renters. This underassessment of FEMA damage of actual damages suffered by rental units means that too little assistance is provided to renters by FEMA. And because FEMA assessments are the basis of subsequent CDBG-DR funding allocations between homeowners and renters, the renter survivors, who are largely people of color, do not get a fair allocation of funds for their needs. The coordinated collection and compilation of accurate data on disaster survivors is necessary to allocate the money fairly across different geographics and populations, ensuring different income levels, housing tenures, and ethnicities are fairly and proportionally assisted. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and focusing on this important matter.
Thank you for your eloquent statement. Dr. Sim, we're going to hear from you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Cantu, and also your fellow commissioners. Thank you so much for this opportunity to appear before you so that I could discuss Episcopal Health Foundation survey findings and mapping analysis of FEMA application and approval data in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. My name is Xiaoqi Sim. I'm the VP for Research, Innovation, and Evaluation at Episcopal Health Foundation, located in Houston, Texas. The foundation, or EHF, is committed to transforming the health of our communities by going beyond just the doctor's office. By providing grants, working with congregations and community partners, and providing important research, EHF supports solutions that address the underlying causes of poor health. The foundation operates as a supporting organization of the Episcopal Diocese of Texas and works to help 12 million people across the 57 counties in Southeast Texas. After Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast, EHF took an intentional approach to learn about how others were responding to this disaster. We watched federal, state, and local governments respond to this crisis. We also reach out to our peers in the foundation sector across the state to better understand their approaches. One huge gap quickly emerged, which is data. Funders, policymakers, and stakeholders, community stakeholders wanted to better understand the extent and magnitude of the impact, not just at an aggregated level, but at a neighborhood and individual level. At Good Stewards, funders want to know how we could best devote our limited resources to help those most impacted by the disaster. We were very interested in finding out how best to provide this forum where residents and communities most impacted by the hurricane could voice their experience and challenges in recovering from the disaster. In the interest of time, I'll skip the mapping analysis. I'll go right in terms of the polling projects that we had done in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. We partner with Kaiser Family Foundation to conduct a randomized probability-based survey to capture the experience, challenges, and needs of Texans residing in the affected 24-county region at both 3 months and 12 months after the hurricane. All these reports can be accessed on our foundation website, episcopalhealth.org. So very briefly, 3 months after the Hurricane Harvey, what we found was that nearly half of the affected residents said they were not getting the help they needed to recover from the hurricane. Areas that stood out the most were issues like applying for disaster assistance and repairing damages to their home. What we also found was that white and Hispanic Texans who applied for FEMA or SBA assistance were more likely than Black residents who apply, to say the applicants was approved. 34% compared to 28% and 13% respectively. 2/3 of the residents reported that they suffer property damages, employment disruptions, as well as lost income due to Hurricane Harvey. We also found that among those whose home were damaged, about half said they had homeowners or renters insurance, and roughly a quarter had flood insurance. Again, lower income residents, Black and Hispanics, were all less likely to report having any type of insurance. Immigrants who were living along the Texas Gulf Coast were also more likely than their native-born neighbors to suffer employment and income losses as a result of Hurricane Harvey. So what happened 1 year after the hurricane? Some of the data that we were able to estimate based on our randomized survey was that in addition to federal disaster assistance, about 3 in 10 said that they received help paying for food, housing, and healthcare from a local or national charity. Hispanic residents are somewhat more likely than white residents to report receiving such help, but otherwise the share who receive help does not differ too much by race, income, or geography. However, a growing what we are seeing also is that a growing share of affected residents said that their lives are back on track, but that 3 in 10 said that their lives remain disrupted. Again, the data show us that affected residents who are Black, have lower incomes, or live in the Golden Triangle region were more likely to say that their lives are still disrupted and less likely to say they are getting the help they need with recovery. So in the wake of Harvey, many affected residents, particularly those that are Black, Hispanic, or have lower income, report financial problems such as falling behind in their rent or mortgages, having problem paying for food, taking on extra work, or borrowing money from friends and relatives to make ends meet. This polling data consistently show that Black and Hispanic Texans and those that who have lower incomes were impacted disproportionately by the disaster at both 3 months and 1 year after the Hurricane Harvey. As a foundation, we had widely disseminated the mapping analysis and the polling results in 2017 and 2018. Beyond just trying to get media coverage, our staff, our colleagues have made data presentations to various government agencies, funders, and or community stakeholder groups. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to make brief remark before the commission. I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. And all our reports are accessible on our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you. Now I'm going to call on Mr. Hirsch.
Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to say thank you to the people on this call that are doing the incredible and difficult work. And I've been lucky to collaborate with a lot of you guys over the last 4 years. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think that the people that have spoken before me have done a really good job explaining at a large scale what's going on. And I wanted to fill in with some quotations from a neighborhood research project that West Street Recovery has been working on that I think add unfortunately, some pain and some detail. So this is a conversation between 2 community members who are interviewing each other about the disaster. One of them said, and then, like I said, my mindset, it changes about all that. How the government treats people. And I mean, how the government looks at certain individuals and certain neighborhoods like ours, the way they do. Yes, I know, because it's eye-opening, but at the same time, it's enough to make you mad because, if you don't fit into a certain criteria, you mean just nothing to the government. Right, it devalues you. Yeah, so that doesn't help your self-esteem none whatsoever, knowing no matter what you do, you're still going to be considered nothing or expendable by this government. So, it's like, why believe in America? America doesn't believe in me. And that's a quote from a conversation between 2 really good friends of mine, Mal Moses and Doris Brown, whose homes were destroyed both by Hurricane Harvey. And I think that really captures the experience of being a person that lives in Northeast Houston and trying to interact with the government to recover. So I think that the problem has been really well outlined. And what I want to say is that there are 3 changes that could be made that would be really impactful to improve how FEMA interacts with communities. The first is that the administrative burden on people applying needs to be lowered. It needs to be lowered immediately. And there's a lot of information that people have to apply that the government already knows. And this is something that residents express over and over. Why do I need to provide the deed to my house when the deed is at the tax office? Why can't one government agency ask for another government agency to supply it? I'm going to just read a quote explaining this from these interviews. A lot of agencies will ask you, do you have any pictures? Pictures? I was fighting for my life. I'm sorry I forgot to take a picture. You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry I forgot to take a picture of me in the water, in the dark. I'm sorry I forgot to take a picture of my wet car, totally destroyed, full of water. This is silly stuff. It's crazy. It's demoralizing. It's really something to have to post the truth over and over again to these people who will never talk to you again, just so that they'll help you. I think that that's a really important quote when we're thinking about what the FEMA application process should look like and could look like. The second thing is that we need to stop denying people for having airship property. And thanks to the panelists who already mentioned this. Families have airship property because often they don't have the resources to transfer title, or because they're using a collective economic strategy to survive in a situation of declining wealth, declining opportunities, and structural oppression. It's not an accident. It's often an intentional choice that there are good reasons for families to keep collective ownership of a property. It's a colonial mentality that only one person can own one piece of land, and that's being perpetuated by that rule. The USDA knows that over 20,000 Black families lost houses because of the airship property barrier after Katrina. This has been known for almost 20 years, and the government has the power to change that rule. So I hope that this testimony does something to do that. And the final thing is that the idea of deferred maintenance, or that there were problems that predate a storm. That is essentially punishing low-income homeowners for being poor. That is what it is. And it is fair to say that in a moment where a huge amount of capital is being injected into a city post-disaster, there are consultants, there are, as someone mentioned earlier, there are equity consultants that make a ton of money. There are private case management firms that make a ton of money, and their wealth is increased through these processes. And the wealth of people that live in deteriorated homes that have been deteriorated through no fault of their own. Let's keep in mind that people face racial barriers to employment. They face language barriers to employment. They are denied aid. And in our interviews, what people said is that they felt that FEMA inspectors had rejected the whole neighborhood in their mind before they went into a single home. And we heard stories of applicants who said they got a rejection text message within 10 minutes of the FEMA inspector leaving their house. I would love to think that those stories were exaggerations, except for that I've heard so many of those stories, and we have so much documentation. The feeling that the FEMA application process and the federal aid process is giving people is this. This is another quote from this paper. It was like, we're living in a throwaway zone. The area I stay in, it's like, the people with power, the people with money, they think everybody here is expendable. But nothing, you can't just sweep people under the carpet without, nothing being done or said about it. And I've had enough. And I think that that's really important. The idea of entire communities being considered expendable or less worthy, that their lives don't matter, is something that is being communicated to them by the way that interacting with governments is post-disaster. And it's amplifying previously existing inequalities. And at each stage, residents are asked to make changes in their life and changes in the way they operate to access aid, when all the power is with the government, and the government could easily make changes to make that aid more accessible. And so I think that the onus is really on FEMA and also on the state and city agencies to make those changes to make the just recovery possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch. That was a very, very powerful presentation. I would like now to call on Tomas Aguilar, Director Recovery Coordinator for the Living Hope Wheelchair Association. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Cantu. And thank you, Kathy, Chancio, Julia, and Ben, and Xiaoqi. I'm going to try not to cover what's already been covered and in the previous panels as well. So yes, I am Tomas, and I work with Living Hope Wheelchair Association, and we've been around about 15 years. And part of the theme of what I'm going to present today is, so we started as a mutual aid, as they call it, organization, when budget cuts for our members who are mostly injured, spinal cord injuries, and are now in wheelchairs, budget cuts. So you no longer have the medical supplies that you need to live, right? Catheters. So they started meeting together, collecting, pooling resources, and giving it out to each other. 15 years later, we have a warehouse, 2 small warehouses, and we give out wheelchairs, catheters, diapers, at no charge at all to those that need it, right? The reason I gave a little bit of context is when we're looking at and talking about natural hazards or disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, we right after Hurricane Harvey, we came up with a survey and issued a report, pre-existing conditions in a time of disaster, right? So pretty much what we were saying is, for some communities, imagine being not speaking English. You're living in a citizen and a resident of this area. We're residents of Houston. If you look at some buildings on Rice University campus, most of the highways, anywhere you go, construction on those is being done by among others Spanish-speaking folks, right? You get injured on the job, and when you're a low-wage worker, your body is your source of income, your tool, right? So now it's broke. So living in a disaster condition, surviving day to day, sometimes hour by hour, that is the reality for many people here, right? So add a layer of natural disaster, right? Add a Hurricane Harvey to it. So then it makes everything worse. Now add on top of that, add the pandemic or the winter freeze. So everything that's been talked about today is like accessing the system, right? If you cannot access it, or if you may not have documentation, so you don't even try, right? Where do you go, right? Or there may be a large agency which they require certain documents because their federal dollars are connected to it and they have to ask them. It excludes so many different people. We've talked about folks that rent, and let's look a little deeper at trailer homes, right? Right after Harvey, a lot of folks were buying damaged mobile homes because they just painted it over and it's better than the moldy place they live in, or people just continue to live in. And if you know anything about trying to clean a mobile home after disaster, it's almost impossible, right? So we have these conditions, right? You cannot get to places. It's hard even to go and apply. You get there and collect all this information, and it's in a different language. Oh, but we translated it. And then you get this document and it's translated and it's very legalese and whatnot. It's like, what? And then, it's hard to complete the application. You just give up, right? Imagine calling all these systems, right? 211, 311, all these different systems, and just to get to your language, it's an ordeal, right? And then when you get there, you're being told things that are, these are the rules. This is what you have to accept. So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of different layers to look at any population, right? With us, we look at social vulnerability index, right? Our folks live everywhere because you have to, right? I'm staying with a friend, or, so it's really hard to get counted sometimes, right? So we're being asked to provide data all the time. And most of the times it doesn't result in anything, right? We need it, data for data's sake, right? I'm like, well, what's up with that? Because we're giving you this data, although we need data because we want to match them with agencies given aid or whatnot. I don't want to overburden the person. So I'm just going to ask for this type of data that allow them to get aid. I understand this, you have good intentions, or, it could be a university or a hospital. They want data for data's sake, and that's all fine on a certain level, but we can't keep burdening folks in the middle of a disaster, right? So we have these situations that hit some communities harder than others, right? We've heard from the panelists all the different ways that certain communities are consistently being ignored and being, the result's always the same. We make a few steps forward, but it's always the same, right? The good thing is there can be some change, we think, and FEMA and the government's role, right? Talk to folks on the ground, right? There's groups, West Street Recovery, other folks, they're on the ground. We're there, we're not going anywhere, right? So when you're designing these policies, when you're designing the rules and all this, include folks that are on the ground and not just like, mid-level groups, but include everyone, right? And perhaps even include people affected, right? That's not a novel idea, but it doesn't happen, right? We talk about language access. Let's think about language justice and disaster justice, right? We don't want to just tweak these systems so we might make the application process smoother. Yeah, of course. But when we talk about justice, we want to question the systems themselves, right? Disaster recovery, disasters, it's a constant state of being, and it'll get worse. And for some communities, social disasters, right? The lack of jobs, the lack of income or medical access to medical, those are everyday life. So what if we thought and start rethinking the whole, disaster recovery complex and the government's response? I know we have it in us, and I know there's plenty of great ideas and voices on the ground. So I would invite, the government to come and have a chat and let's work on a solution, something different. We can do better than what we have right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. And I really appreciate your optimism. I appreciate the positive statements of all of the panel. Y'all show me why I'm really proud to be a part of the Texas community and the US community. I mean, Americans are innovators, and we're innovators first. And so this panel has done a terrific job of sharing how wide the problem is and offering some really cogent potential solutions that I'm optimistic about. I'm going to turn now to my colleagues. I see Commissioner Adams already has his hand up. That's a good way to catch my eye because my eyes are jumping across the screen. Commissioner Adams.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Hirsch. Mr. Hirsch, you testified, at least in your written testimony, about the FEMA applications requiring paperwork, proof of income. You call it extensive documentation of damage. You indicated that these folks are expected to go through the arduous work of collecting the documents. What would you propose replace documents such as photographs or other evidence of damage? What would you propose replace these arduous documents?
Thank you for the question.
That's all right.
I think there's two things I would suggest. One is, as I said in my spoken testimony, that any document that another government has should be moved from government to government. So for example, the IRS has income information, and the counties and cities have home ownership information. So that's one thing I would suggest, and maybe a applicant could opt into it. The second thing is that if you've ever, in our experience, one of the things that you have to be able to demonstrate is the difference between before and after a storm. So I don't know about you, but I've never walked around my house and taken pictures of the four corners of the house, every few months in case a disaster is going to come, for example. So I think it is true that some visual indication of damage is fair to ask for people. But what I think is that having done the application and appeal process with many, many people, and being someone who's incredibly privileged and has a master's degree, the amount of documentation that you're asked to provide is a lot, and that the thresholds should be lower. Like the burden of proof should be lower, particularly when there are actually maps of where it flooded. So for example, we have people who, one of the streets we work on, Kellett Street, everyone on the street got 5.5 feet of water in their house. And so when two people, when 8911 and 8915 proved that there was 5 feet of water, like the house in between them clearly also got 5 feet of water. And so what I think is that the burden of proof should be lowered. And I think it's a very fair question. How do we do that?
If I might follow up, let's talk about how far it should be lowered. In the example you just gave with the two houses got flooding, and the one in between that obviously probably did. Is it your suggestion that there be no obligation whatsoever to show damage for that house with documents or photographs? Is that what you're suggesting?
My suggestion is not that there would be no documentation, but I think, for example, like if you've ever gotten in a car accident, the kind of documentation you have to give, where you write a little paragraph or you talk to the insurance adjuster on the phone to describe what happened. Geico can approve a claim based on that. Unfortunately, I've been in a car accident and experienced that. It's not an advertisement for Geico. But that's what I would suggest, is that a more accessible and human process should be applied, and that pictures are great, but the idea that if you didn't have a pre-disaster picture, and one of the things that happens is that gets combined with that bias that people have. Oh, you're a Black person, your house was decrepit before. I'm going to say, that's what we heard. And so
this is something FEMA adjusters or investigators are telling people, that you're a Black person, your house is decrepit?
Well, that's what in our testimony, in our interviews that we've done about how people felt and what their experience was, they said that their whole neighborhood had been rejected based on, preconceived notions of how people lived in those areas. And I think if you, I see the director of Fifth Ward nodding your head there. And, I think that that's a pretty consistent impression that people in Northeast Houston.
But I want to make sure that the record is clear on this, because there will be a transcript that the staff will build off. Are you suggesting you have incidents of FEMA employees saying you're a Black person, your house is decrepit, or are they just leaving that impression with somebody?
They're leaving. That's a great point of clarification. They're leaving that impression. And I would also say that in the zip code we mostly work, the approval rate was 12% for FEMA applicants. So there's a number there that maybe these people's experience of their own life is accurate.
Fifth Ward can attest that there are families that their houses are being told that they're depreciable and not supported.
Okay. Any other commissioners would like
Commissioner Curzon now raised his hand.
Thank you. I didn't see that.
I just want to drill down a little bit more, because this gets to the crux of it. First of all, thank you very much for your testimonies. How is it that FEMA is leaving this impression? What are they saying? What are they doing that leaves the impression in the minds of homeowners that they're being treated differently because their homes are decrepit because they're Black?
Is there someone in particular you'd like to answer that?
Anybody who has any information.
Anyone on the panel, please.
I'd like to know, what is being said by FEMA representatives, and what's been reported that they have said that could give the impression that FEMA's rejecting them or treating them differently on the basis of race?
This is Kathy Payton from Houston's Fifth Ward. We've had a number of instances directly in Fifth Ward where the housing stock is greater than 40 years old. And so the value of the current home is depreciated, and they are being told specifically that the value of the home makes them ineligible to receive the benefits. And it's not as blatant and directly to say that it's because they're Black, but it's because of the age and the condition of the housing stock in the area and their home as well.
Thank you.
I'd love to send you our report of these interviews, but one thing that we hear consistently, or two things, is inspectors that don't go into the house. So they just stand in the yard, and then someone gets denied. So that's a sign that they didn't really take the issue seriously. And then or that they're understaffed, right? That's a problem that could be solved. And another one, that people have visible mold in their house being told that their home is livable. So that the home is clearly not livable and being told they're livable. And that gives them the impression that they're expected to live in a dangerous situation, that that's acceptable to the government.
Mr. Aguilar.
Yes, I would like to add in our interviews, and again, these are interviews taking place right after Harvey. and visiting homes. We raised a small amount of funds to help folks out. And among the comments as well is, and I will clarify, not just FEMA, but the different types of aid coming in. Comments such as like, well, it was already moldy to begin with, and you all like living, you don't mind living. That was a comment. You don't mind living that way. Comments to that effect, right? And it's like, or well, how you live, another person. And the person asks, in Spanish, ¿Cómo vivo? Pues tú sabes. And they're like, how do you live? What do you mean? And how do I live? And it's like, well, and then it kind of died out there, right? So there's ways that aren't as explicit as saying, in this case, you're Latino, blah, 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 and that's your fault. You don't have to say that when you have those dialogues like that, and there's this resistance right from the start. It's how you live, and it's loaded, right? So, yeah, I just want to throw that in there because it's not always very straightforward, right?
Yes, Commissioner Cladney.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused, but when you said, Ms. Payton, that your people in your ward were told the house is depreciated, are they saying that the house isn't worth repair, or that they just would assume not repaired, or just pay whatever it's worth and leave it as it is? Or I'm confused on that.
The house isn't worth repairing, and or they couldn't identify the damages that were actually sustained by that particular storm. And either way, the claim is denied.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gilchrist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want a quick follow-up on this. So these reports that the panelists are raising, I was curious to know if any of these allegations were reported directly to FEMA. And that's for anybody that wants to answer.
I think we raised them at the first hearing. I did.
I'm sorry?
I raised those at the first hearing that we had with the FEMA representatives back a few months ago.
I can answer for us. Any of our constituents, whether they're documented, undocumented, whether you have a record, right? We value privacy and confidentiality, and the purpose for us is to try to match them with aid wherever it may come from. But we take serious this idea of not sharing this information. Sometimes we share aggregate data, we have, but we don't match it up. So in cases like that, I would answer no, but it's a bigger context to look at, right? Like, yeah, for those reasons.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I would just like to say that I do believe that lots of people do try and appeal and go through the appeal process, which is also a very tedious process for people. I will mention that I worked with someone that was affected by Harvey, is still living in a gutted home, and she was affected also by Imelda. And when the Imelda inspector came, which we know that FEMA should apply, give assistance for whatever that storm that is dedicated to that storm. She was flooded in Imelda, and the inspector told her that all the damages that are currently in her home were Harvey based. And so her denial letter, as a previous panelist said, that it said home is safe to occupy. That was her denial. And she appealed several times, and she continued to be denied. So she did not get any FEMA assistance for her damages in Imelda because her home is still and continues to be devastated by Hurricane Harvey.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Just to say that we've helped a number of families appeal, and a number of those appeals have been successful. So instead of filing a complaint, I mean, the family's main interest is to get the aid that they need. So that's been our approach.
Yeah. I would like to add another thing to this. So when I got the information for this panel and I was reading it and I was questioning, okay, if the goal is, yes, FEMA, but if the goal is to how can we have a just recovery, right? A recovery that's fair and equitable, and how can we change the things that aren't working and build on the things that are? If that's one of the goals, in our communities, we're so far removed from, we do have folks, a few folks that have applied to FEMA and some that have actually gotten it, but most are so far removed from that. So we're depending on maybe local, county, charities and all this, but it's the same thing. How do we recover for this? How do we survive this disaster, right? So if the goal is an overarching, like we need to make this better and all this, I think what I offer isn't so much FEMA, it's the whole process, right? And I think it's a worthy goal, right? And I think FEMA has a large role to play in it. But I would be lying if I said, oh yeah, FEMA this. No, because we're so far removed from that. You know, if you're a renter living in a trailer, if you know, transient, staying here and there, it's a different world, but there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people like that, living like that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
I think Debo was that.
Madam Chair, I think you're on mute. Are you calling on me or Commissioner Xiaoqi?
I apologize. I'm sorry. All right. The queue is Michael Xiaoqi, then Debo Adegbile, and then I saw another hand. Who was it? Nope. Okay, that's
I think it's both our hands. I think it's both our hands.
Okay, there you go.
I had a quick question. First of all, Mr. Hirsch, the air property thing sort of blows my mind, but it goes into the whole issue of the documentation in general. And I want to reference this with specifically to the Latinx or Hispanic community. To what extent was it made public that FEMA aid was available to you regardless of your documentation status? How many in terms of Hurricane Harvey, or was that well publicized, or was it something? Because I hear that people were concerned about applying for federal aid because of their immigration status in this country. I'm just wondering if anyone here has any information about that. Mr. Aguilar?
Yeah, sure. With us, we would assess, are you an owner? Very few people were owners. If folks were owners, we would explain what we knew of FEMA, and we had a process to get them to the office or to get someone to help them. And we would explain what we knew. We had a fact sheet of it. But also, just because that's, you know, anyone can apply if you're, you know, you don't have to be this and that. There's still all these other barriers that Ben and others mentioned as well, right? And that complicates itself when you start throwing it through another language. And also, like, culture is a big thing, and what your background is. If you can, like Ben said, he has a master's and he's found it confusing. So yeah, so when it was relevant and in our surveys, well, like, yes, here, and this is what it is, and this is what we understand, but we would always send them there. But very few people, because most of our community in wheelchairs, trailer homes, and renting. But yes, we did refer, and there was information everywhere. But just because you drop off a flyer or get an email, that's just like the tip of it, right? So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And after Commissioner Adegbile, I'm going to have to do a hard stop unless there's someone who really needs to get in a last word. Okay, you've got the last word, Commissioner Adegbile.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to the conversation about the perceptions and/or experiences with race disparities or feeling that people are being treated differently on the basis of their race by the government. Some of what I hear is that there's a perception that there are pieces of the structural assessments that disadvantaged neighborhoods that may be, they're not racially segregated by law, but there are many neighborhoods that by virtue of history and the practices in Texas and elsewhere are racially identifiable neighborhoods. They're census tracts that are minority majority neighborhoods. Very often they're not minority majority neighborhoods by accident. There is a history that has led to them, including a government involved history that has helped define some of these neighborhoods. And so they are characterized that way, and they're known to be that way. And very often it may affect property values and comparative property values. So what I'm hearing is that there is, in a sense, some of the structures and the history, the claims of race in America are leading to a factor where when aid is being doled out after a hurricane, some of the structures and history is leading to impact for people that have already been disadvantaged in these neighborhoods are having that disadvantage, in a sense, compounded by some things that are not within their control. But then separately, I did hear that there is some conduct, there are some circumstantial evidence of workers that may be otherizing or making assumptions about the value, standing in a yard to make a judgment about what's inside and what the condition of a home is, or making assumptions more broadly that people feel, that they feel when they're having these experiences. And we know that these things are not made up because there are recent studies where Black people have been in a home, a biracial couple, a Black person is in a home showing their home, and the appraiser will value the home less than when an appraiser comes back and the white spouse is in the home, and or the Black art and accoutrements of African-American tradition are taken down from the interior of the home. And the appraiser, again, this is not in a FEMA context. I want the record to be clear. The example that I'm giving is a well-described example. People can Google it and find it, but it's not in a FEMA context. But I'm just suggesting that there are ways in which people can discern that people are being treated differently by virtue of where they live and assumptions that are being made. So what I'd like to hear in light of that is, do you have any concrete suggestions about how we can have FEMA more justly and equitably respond to hurricane disasters? What are the one or two things that you think could help FEMA more justly or equitably provide its service, which is in everybody's interest?
Commissioner, if I may, this is Chancio once again with the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion Emergency Management, and I've been an emergency manager for almost 25 years. There are many things that FEMA could do to make disaster response and recovery more equitable. As we discussed earlier, training the cadre of responders and inspectors, not only in anti-racism, but also in basic cultural competency, which is to respect and understand the culture and the languages of the people in the neighborhoods and communities that they're entering and serving. That's just one basic step. And when we discuss the issue of denial rates for lower income communities, for communities of color, that is actually proven by data. So it is not inferred, it is not a perception, it is proven. And there are many articles that are available and research that is being done and has already been done on these subjects. It's important to mention that cost benefit analysis is inequitable. Anything that adds more complexity to recovering is inequitable. A lot of these programs and proofs of insurance or proofs of documentation is done to protect the federal government, not the people they're serving. It's done to, in their minds, mitigate fraud. But there is only 1% of fraud that is ever occurring in many of these disasters. So you're protecting 1% of a chance for fraud. The majority of people are denied because they are being turned away because of a likelihood or a thought that there is a likelihood of fraud, similar to looting. It just doesn't happen in the way that the media may report or the federal government feels it occurs. It's not happening in that way. And so a lot of what we're seeing and what the data is proving frankly, is that bias and racism come to the table. If you have it with you as an inspector, you bring that to the job. If you have bias or any element of discrimination inherently within you, you bring that to disaster response. You bring that to preparedness. You bring that to mitigation and funding decisions. We haven't even discussed infrastructure because honestly, a lot of this could be mitigated by providing more funding to lower income neighborhoods, but unfortunately, mitigation funding just doesn't go to these lower income communities, and it's because of discrimination. So there's more to discuss, but I see Commissioner, the chair, giving me the hand, so thank you.
Chancio Willis, I see the other panelists nodding at your powerful statements, and I am very grateful for it. I apologize, we're not going to have enough time because I've got to give information to the general public listening that there is going to be an opportunity to supplement the record, and that you as panelists can do this, but the general public also has that access to us. So let me give you that information. This brings to end the briefing part of our meeting, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all our panelists. It's been very informative. And on behalf of the entire commission, I want to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise with us. Also, again, thank the staff. They've worked very, very hard in the past few months during a pandemic to pull this virtual hearing together. And in advance, they're going to keep working on this. So in advance, I'm going to thank them for going through and combing through all this information and incorporating it into a report. The record for the briefing shall remain open for the next 30 days. If panelists or members of the public would like to submit materials, they can submit it to the commission, but no later than November 22nd, 2021. The email is very easy. It's one word, Harvey Briefing. Harvey Briefing at usccr.gov. If you mail it, our address is OCRE, Public Comments, Attention, Harvey Briefing, U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and our address is 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C., 20425. This commission encourages the use of mail to give public comments due to the pandemic. So don't phone it in. Don't try to come to our office. Please use the address 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C., 20425. I want to thank you all. It's been a blessed day. I have learned so much from all of you. The briefing has ended. Be safe.